In the languid, heavy air of the low country, secrets are a part of the landscape, buried deep in the pluff mud and hidden beneath the shadows of ancient oaks. We often think of deadly passions as explosive, sudden things. But the most dangerous affairs are the ones that grow slowly, silently, like a venomous vine in a beautiful garden, wrapping themselves around a family until they choke the very life from it. This is the story of an unholy trinity: a tyrannical husband, a suffocated wife, and a desperate young man caught in the middle. It's a story of a love so forbidden, so twisted, it could only be sanctified by blood. They say blood is thicker than water, but in the end, the murky, unforgiving water of the marsh would be their only accomplice. Before we wade into this dark and treacherous tale of betrayal and murder, please subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell. You won't want to miss how this venomous love story ends. Now, let us take you to the Miller estate, a gilded cage where a mother-in-law and a son-in-law found a common cause in their shared hatred, and a common solace in each other's arms. The Miller estate, known simply as Riverbend, was less a home and more a declaration of dominance over the humid South Carolina lowcountry. The main house, a sprawling antebellum masterpiece with imposing white columns and a deep, shaded veranda, stood on a bluff overlooking the serpentine coils of the Ashepoo River. The grounds were a carefully curated illusion of natural beauty, manicured lawns that bled into wild, untamed salt marshes, where the air was thick with the smell of brine and decay. It was a place of breathtaking beauty and suffocating stillness, a perfect reflection of its master, Frank Miller. Frank, at 55, was a man carved from granite and quiet rage. He had built a construction empire from the ground up, and he ruled his family with the same ruthless, uncompromising authority he used to run his business. He was a man of few words, his presence alone enough to suck the warmth from a room. His approval was a rare and precious commodity, and his disapproval was a cold, heavy silence that could last for days, a form of psychological warfare that left his family perpetually on edge, desperate to please him. His wife, Amelia, was the estate's most beautiful, most tragic ornament. At 52, she still possessed a fragile, aristocratic beauty, with high cheekbones and expressive, melancholic eyes. She moved through the grand, silent rooms of Riverbend with a practiced, weightless grace, a ghost in her own home. She had married Frank 30 years ago, a vibrant, artistic young woman from a good Charleston family, full of dreams and passion. Frank had seen her not as a partner, but as an acquisition, a beautiful asset to complete the picture of his success. Over 3 decades, he had systematically dismantled her spirit, not with fists, but with a steady, corrosive drip of condescension and control. Her art studio was now a storage room. Her opinions were charming notions. Her life was a meticulously managed performance for the benefit of Frank's reputation. Their only child, Clara, was the one pure, uncomplicated thing in Amelia's life. At 24, Clara was a gentle, optimistic soul who had somehow managed to grow in the shadow of her father's oppressive nature without being completely crushed by it. She possessed her mother's beauty and a sweet, earnest nature that Frank found irritatingly naive. Clara's great act of rebellion, and the source of the family's current simmering tension, was her husband, Ethan. Ethan, at 26, was everything Frank Miller was not. He was a musician, a quiet, sensitive man with a poet's soul and a musician's unsteady income. He played the cello with a passion that was both breathtaking and, in Frank's eyes, utterly useless. Frank saw Ethan as a weak, effeminate freeloader who had bewitched his daughter. He had only consented to the marriage after a year of Clara's tearful pleading, and he made his disdain for his son-in-law clear at every opportunity. He would call him the artist, the words dripping with a venomous sarcasm. He would interrupt Ethan mid-sentence at the dinner table, turning to another guest as if he hadn't spoken. He had given the young couple a small, charming guest house on the estate to live in, a gesture that looked generous to the outside world but was, in reality, a way to keep Clara under his roof and Ethan under his thumb. For Ethan, living at Riverbend was a special kind of hell. He loved Clara with a fierce, protective devotion, but the constant, silent judgment of her father was like a stone in his shoe, a persistent, painful irritant. He felt emasculated, his worth constantly measured against Frank's rigid, materialistic standards and found wanting. The grand estate was a beautiful prison, and Frank was the warden. The only person in that prison who seemed to understand his plight was Amelia. The connection between Amelia and Ethan was born in the shared, silent spaces of their mutual oppression. It began with small, stolen moments of understanding. Amelia would be the only one to listen, truly listen, when Ethan spoke of a new piece of music he was composing. She would ask him about chord progressions and melodic structures, her eyes lighting up with an intelligent curiosity that had long been extinguished in other areas of her life. In turn, Ethan was the only one who saw past the perfect, serene facade of Mrs. Miller. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes when Frank dismissed her. He noticed that she still kept a single, charcoal-stained easel in the back of a closet, a relic of a life she was no longer allowed to live. They were two artists, trapped in the court of a barbarian king, and they recognized the soul of a fellow prisoner in each other's eyes. Their conversations, held in quiet corners of the library or on the far end of the veranda, became their only refuge. They spoke of art, of music, of the books Frank dismissed as pretentious nonsense. They spoke of the world beyond Riverbend, a world where passion and beauty were valued. They never spoke directly of Frank, but his oppressive presence was the ghost that haunted every word they said. They were allies in a cold war, offering each other the small comfort of mutual recognition. The unspoken alliance began its slow, perilous slide into something more dangerous on a sweltering August evening. Frank was in one of his black moods, the silence at the dinner table so thick and heavy it felt like a physical weight. He had just lost a major contract, and the full force of his foul temper was being unleashed on his family in the form of a suffocating, hostile quiet. After the meal, Frank retreated to his study with a bottle of bourbon, slamming the door behind him. Clara, accustomed to her father's moods, tried to lighten the atmosphere with cheerful, nervous chatter before excusing herself to bed, claiming a headache. Ethan and Amelia were left alone on the veranda, the air thick with the sound of cicadas and the heavy perfume of night-blooming jasmine. "He can't stand to see anyone else happy," Amelia said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the most direct criticism of her husband Ethan had ever heard her utter. "It's not your fault," Ethan said, his voice equally quiet. "Isn't it?" she replied, a bitter smile touching her lips. "I've had 30 years of practice at setting him off. You'd think I'd have mastered the art of being invisible by now." She looked out at the dark, ribbon-like river. "He used to tell me my paintings were good. He even bought me that easel in the closet. He said it was to encourage me, but it was a test. The more I painted, the colder he became. He didn't want me to have anything that was just mine. So I stopped." Ethan felt a surge of a complex, powerful emotion, a mixture of profound pity for her and a white-hot anger at Frank. He saw, in her story, a terrifying premonition of his own future with Clara, of the slow, relentless pressure to abandon his own passion. "You should paint again," he said, his voice soft but intense. "Don't let him win." Amelia turned to look at him, her eyes glistening in the moonlight. For the first time, he wasn't just looking at his wife's mother. He was seeing a beautiful, intelligent, and deeply wounded woman, and in her gaze, he saw not just gratitude, but a raw, aching loneliness that mirrored his own. A spark, born of shared pain and artistic kinship, had been struck, and in the oppressive, humid stillness of the low-country night, it began to glow with a dangerous, forbidden heat. The spark ignited on the veranda did not extinguish. It smoldered, a secret heat between Amelia and Ethan, transforming the atmosphere of the estate. Their stolen conversations took on a new charge, a new intimacy. A shared glance across the dinner table became a conspiratorial act, a brush of hands as one passed the other a book in the library, a moment of startling, electric contact. They were orbiting each other in a dangerous, silent dance, their shared resentment of Frank the gravitational force pulling them inexorably closer. The serpent entered their garden of shared misery in the form of a cello. Ethan had been offered a prestigious, year-long residency with a small but acclaimed quartet in Boston. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to finally earn the professional respect he craved and, more importantly, a chance to escape Riverbend. He and Clara could live on his stipend. It would be a struggle, but they would be free. He told Clara the news first, his voice alight with an excitement she hadn't heard in years. She was thrilled for him, her love for him pure and supportive. But when they approached Frank, the dream was brutally suffocated in its cradle. They found him in his study, a grand, masculine room of dark wood and leather that smelled of cigar smoke and power. Frank listened to Ethan's excited explanation without comment, his face a stony, unreadable mask. When Ethan finished, Frank leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Boston," he said, the word dripping with disdain. "And how much does this residency pay?" Ethan told him the modest figure of the stipend. Frank let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "And you expect to support my daughter on that? In one of the most expensive cities in the country? She'll be living in a slum." "We'd make it work," Clara interjected, her voice pleading. "It's what Ethan loves, Daddy. It's his dream." "His dream," Frank repeated, his cold eyes finally settling on Ethan. "His dream is to be a kept man, living off my daughter while he scrapes away at that oversized violin. You are not taking my daughter to go live in poverty so you can indulge your little hobby. You will stay here and you will get a real job. I can get you a position as a project manager at my company. You'll learn what it means to be a man, to provide for your wife." The ultimatum was absolute. It was a declaration of ownership, not just over Clara, but over Ethan's life, his future, his very identity. To refuse was to risk Frank turning Clara against him, or cutting them off entirely, leaving them destitute. The joyous hope in Ethan's heart turned to a cold, heavy stone of despair. He saw his future stretching before him. A life in a suit, managing spreadsheets for a man he despised, his cello gathering dust in a corner, his soul slowly shriveling until he became as empty and gray as the concrete his father-in-law poured. The aftermath of that confrontation was devastating. Clara was torn between her husband and her father, her attempts at peacemaking only highlighting the impossible chasm between the two men. Ethan retreated into a sullen, bitter silence. He stopped playing his cello altogether. The music had died within him, murdered by Frank's casual, brutal tyranny. It was Amelia who found him a few days later, sitting on a bench at the edge of the marsh, staring into the black, tannin-stained water. She sat beside him, the silence between them comfortable, familiar. "He's killing you," she said softly. "It wasn't a question." "He already has," Ethan replied, his voice hollow. "He wants to own everything, everyone. He won't be happy until I'm just another one of his projects, built to his specifications." "I know," she whispered, her hand instinctively coming to rest on his arm. At her touch, something inside Ethan broke. The carefully constructed walls of his composure crumbled, and a raw, desperate anguish poured out of him. He turned to her, and in his eyes, she saw the same trapped, hopeless despair she saw in her own mirror every morning. It was a reflection of her own soul. In that moment, she was not his mother-in-law. He was not her daughter's husband. They were simply two prisoners, sharing a moment of profound, unbearable recognition. Acting on an impulse that was a decade of silent suffering made manifest, Amelia leaned in and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of shared pain, of mutual desperation, a raw and hungry collision of two starving souls. It was a transgression so profound, so absolute, that it was both terrifying and intoxicatingly liberating. It was an act of rebellion against the man who owned them both. The kiss ignited the smoldering embers of their connection into a raging, uncontrollable fire. It was the beginning of their affair, an affair conducted in stolen moments, in hushed whispers in forgotten rooms of the great house, in the deep, concealing shadows of the estate. Their passion was fueled by its own forbidden nature, a dangerous, addictive cocktail of lust, loneliness, and a shared, venomous hatred for Frank. Their lovemaking was a desperate, almost violent act of reclamation. In each other's arms, they were not the possessions of Frank Miller. Amelia was no longer the silent, ornamental wife. She was a passionate, desirable woman. Ethan was not the weak, failed artist. He was a virile, powerful man. They were taking back the pieces of themselves that Frank had tried to destroy. But their secret world was a fragile one, built on a foundation of lies and conducted under the constant threat of discovery. The guilt, especially for Ethan, was a corrosive acid. He loved Clara, and every lie he told her, every secret touch he shared with her mother, was a fresh act of betrayal that tore him apart. He was living a fractured existence, his life a web of contradictions. It was Amelia who was the more pragmatic, the more ruthless. 30 years of living with Frank had forged her emotions into something hard and sharp. Her love for Ethan was real, but so was her hatred for her husband. She began to see their affair not just as a solace, but as a weapon. The idea, when it was finally spoken aloud, came from her. They were in the old, dusty art studio, their secret sanctuary. Ethan was racked with guilt, speaking of ending it, of his love for Clara, of the impossibility of their situation. "There is a way," Amelia had said, her voice a low, steady hum, her eyes fixed on his. "A way for us to be free. For you and Clara to be free. For me to be free." Ethan stared at her, not comprehending. "He is the cage, Ethan," she continued, her voice dropping even lower. "He is the bars, the lock, the key. As long as he is alive, none of us will ever be truly free. He will never let you go. He will never let Clara go. And he will certainly never let me go." She let the words hang in the air, a poisonous, seductive vapor. The idea was monstrous, unthinkable, but it was also a perfect, terrifying solution. The thought of a world without Frank Miller, a world where he could play his music, where Clara would be happy, where Amelia would be. His was a vision of paradise. "I wish he were dead," Ethan whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Amelia's hand found his, her grip surprisingly strong. "Wishes," she said, her eyes dark and intense, "are for children. Adults make plans." The serpent had not just entered their garden. It had offered them the forbidden fruit. And in the dark, twisted logic of their passionate, desperate world, they were beginning to convince themselves that to eat it was not a sin, but a sacrament. The decision, once spoken, hung between them, a living, breathing entity. It was no longer a fleeting, vengeful fantasy. It was a viable, terrifying option. The days that followed were thick with a new, unspoken tension. Every interaction with Frank, every casual cruelty, every dismissive gesture, was no longer just an insult to be endured. It was a justification, another log on the pyre they were secretly building for him. They began to speak of the problem in coded, elliptical terms. Their affair, once a refuge from Frank, was now a war room where they planned his demise. It was Amelia who was the architect of the plan. Her mind, so long suppressed and dulled by Frank's dominance, now operating with a chilling, diamond-hard clarity. 30 years of observing her husband had made her an expert on his habits, his routines, and his weaknesses. "It has to be an accident," she stated one night, as they lay together in the pre-dawn darkness of a guest bedroom. "Something that cannot be questioned. Something that fits his character." Frank, for all his control, had a reckless, arrogant streak. He believed himself invincible, a master of his domain. His greatest passion outside of his business was his boat, a powerful, flat-bottomed skiff he used to explore the labyrinthine waterways of the Marsh. He would often go out alone at dusk, a bottle of bourbon his only companion, to fish or simply to watch the sunset. He treated the treacherous, shifting tides and hidden oyster beds of the Marsh with a careless contempt, confident in his own skill and the power of his boat. "The Marsh," Ethan breathed, the word full of a dark, final poetry. The marsh, which had been the backdrop to their secret meetings, would become the instrument of their liberation. Amelia's plan was brutally simple and elegant in its plausibility. Frank's boat was his pride, but he was lazy about its maintenance, preferring to pay a local mechanic to handle it. A small, undetectable act of sabotage, combined with his drinking and the inherent dangers of the marsh at night, would create a perfect, tragic narrative. A powerful man, a few too many drinks, a fateful error in judgment. No one would question it. They began their preparations with the meticulous patience of predators. The planning became a part of their intimacy, a dark, unholy sacrament that bound them closer than any physical act. They studied nautical maps, tide charts, and weather patterns. Amelia, using a hidden laptop, researched marine engines, fuel lines, and steering mechanisms. She learned that a small, hairline crack in a fuel line, one that would be almost invisible to a casual inspection but would widen under the pressure and vibration of the engine, could cause a catastrophic fuel leak. A boat stranded in the marsh, a drunk man trying to fix it in the dark, a sudden lurch, a fall into the cold, alligator-infested water. The story wrote itself. Ethan's role was to be the hands of the operation. He was the one who could access the boathouse without raising suspicion. He began spending time down at the dock, ostensibly to fish or to read, but in reality he was studying the boat, familiarizing himself with the engine, the tools, the layout of the boathouse. The guilt that had been eating at him was slowly being cauterized by a cold, thrilling sense of purpose. He was no longer a passive victim of Frank's tyranny. He was an agent of his own destiny. He told himself he was doing this for Clara, to free her from a father who was a poison in her life. This rationalization became his mantra, the prayer he repeated to himself to drown out the screams of his own conscience. The psychological toll of their conspiracy was immense. They had to maintain a flawless performance of normalcy for Clara, who remained blissfully, tragically unaware. Her sweet, cheerful presence was a constant, painful reminder of the innocence they were about to shatter. Every hug, every "I love you," was a fresh wound. Ethan would look at his wife's loving, trusting face and feel a wave of self-loathing so profound it almost buckled his knees. But then he would catch Amelia's eye across the room, a glance of steel and shared resolve, and the feeling would pass, replaced by the cold, hard logic of their plan. They chose a date 2 weeks away, a night with a new moon and a strong outgoing tide. The darkness would be their accomplice, and the tide would help carry any evidence out to sea. The week before the chosen night was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Amelia began to subtly sow the seeds of the narrative she wanted the world to believe. She made a concerned phone call to her closest friend, mentioning that Frank's drinking was getting worse, that she was worried about him going out on the boat alone so often. "He's so reckless," she had sighed into the phone. "He thinks he's immortal." Ethan, meanwhile, played the part of the beaten, submissive son-in-law. He accepted Frank's offer of a job, telling his father-in-law with a feigned, hangdog expression that he had seen the light and was ready to be a real man. Frank was smugly triumphant, his victory over the artist complete. His guard was down, his ego sated. He saw Ethan not as a threat, but as a vanquished foe, a tame pet. The day before the murder, a new complication arose. Clara announced that she had to go into Charleston for an overnight conference for her job as a curator at a local gallery. It was an unexpected gift from fate. Her absence would make the night cleaner, simpler. There would be one less person to lie to in the immediate, tense aftermath. That evening, the four of them had a final dinner together. It was a surreal, funereal affair. Frank was in a magnanimous mood, expansive and condescending, lecturing Ethan on what would be expected of him in his new role. Clara was excited about her trip, her chatter filling the tense silences. And Ethan and Amelia sat opposite each other, two conspirators on the verge of an irrevocable act, communicating in a silent language of shared glances and barely perceptible nods, their minds already in the dark, murky waters of the marsh. After dinner, as Clara packed, Ethan slipped out of the guest house. The air was heavy and still, pregnant with the coming night. He walked down the path to the boathouse, a small, powerful file and a pair of pliers concealed in his pocket. Under the single, dim bulb of the boathouse, he worked quickly, his hands surprisingly steady. He found the fuel line just as Amelia had described. With the file, he carefully, meticulously, scored a deep, thin line into the hard rubber, a wound that was almost invisible. It was done. The mechanism of Frank's death was in place. He returned to the guest house, his heart hammering, a strange, metallic taste in his mouth. Clara kissed him goodbye, her embrace warm and loving. "I'll miss you," she said. "Be nice to Daddy while I'm gone." "I will," he lied, the words feeling like poison on his tongue. He watched her drive away, a beacon of innocence disappearing into the gathering dusk, leaving him alone with her mother, and the terrible, bloody work that lay ahead. The evening air at Riverbend grew thick and heavy as dusk settled, the sky turning a bruised purple. The absence of Clara was a palpable void, leaving Ethan and Amelia alone in the great house with their monstrous secret and the man whose life was now measured in hours. The plan was for Amelia to provoke Frank into one of his solitary, bourbon-fueled boat trips. It required little effort. During their cold, silent dinner, she made a casual, carefully worded comment about his declining influence in the Charleston business community, a story she had fabricated, knowing it would strike directly at his deepest insecurity, the fear of becoming irrelevant. Frank's face darkened, his jaw tightening. He didn't rise to the bait with an argument. He never did. His weapon was a cold, punishing withdrawal. As she knew he would, he rose from the table without a word, poured himself a tumbler of bourbon, and headed for the door. "Going for a ride," he grunted, not looking at her. "Be careful, Frank," Amelia said, her voice a perfect imitation of wifely concern. "The tide is strong tonight." He just slammed the door. From the veranda, she and Ethan watched the single light of his skiff move away from the dock, a lone firefly swallowed by the immense darkness of the river and the marsh. The sound of its powerful engine grew fainter and fainter, until it was finally consumed by the chirping of the crickets and the vast, oppressive silence. Then the waiting began. It was the most agonizing part of their plan, a period of pure, suspended tension. They sat in the dark drawing room, the house silent around them, every creak of the old floorboards, every rustle of leaves in the wind, amplified to a deafening roar. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. They were bound together in a silent, unholy vigil, waiting for a death they had orchestrated. Ethan felt as if his skin were crawling. He imagined the scene in the marsh, the engine sputtering as the fuel line gave way, Frank's drunken frustration turning to confusion, then to fear, as he drifted helplessly in the black, alligator-infested water. Every minute that passed was an eternity. What if he managed to fix it? What if another boat found him? The possibilities for failure were infinite. Amelia was a statue of composure. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene. But Ethan could see the frantic pulse beating in the hollow of her throat, the only betrayal of the maelstrom of emotions that must have been churning inside her. An hour passed, then two. Around 10 p.m., the agreed-upon time, Amelia picked up the phone. Her voice, when she spoke to the sheriff's department, was a masterpiece of controlled panic. "My husband, Frank Miller. He went out on his boat 2 hours ago, and he hasn't returned. He'd had a bit to drink. I'm terribly worried." The machinery of official concern began to turn. A deputy was dispatched to the house. Ethan and Amelia met him on the veranda, playing their parts to perfection. Ethan was the concerned, helpless son-in-law. Amelia was the distraught but composed wife, providing the deputy with all the necessary details. The Coast Guard was notified. A search was launched, but it was a token effort. In the pitch black of a moonless night, on a river that snaked through miles of identical-looking marshland, a full-scale search was impossible until dawn. The rest of the night was a sleepless, surreal blur. The deputy stayed with them, his presence a constant, oppressive reminder of the stakes of their gamble. They drank coffee, their hands trembling, and stared out at the black, unrevealing river. They were actors in a play of their own writing, and the terror of forgetting a line, of making a single fatal mistake was overwhelming. The first call came just after sunrise. It was the Coast Guard. They had found the boat. It was empty, adrift in a wide sound several miles downstream, its engine dead. There was no sign of Frank. An open, half-empty bottle of bourbon was found rolling on the floor of the skiff. The second act of the play began, the performance of grief for the benefit of a returning Clara. Ethan made the call, his voice breaking with expertly feigned sorrow. Her scream of anguish over the phone was a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. She raced home, her face a mask of shattered disbelief. Amelia and Ethan enveloped her in their arms, their own feigned grief a grotesque mockery of her real, soul-crushing pain. She clung to them, her two pillars of support, never dreaming that they were the architects of her misery. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. The search for Frank's body continued, a grim, methodical affair involving boats, helicopters, and divers. The Miller estate was filled with a rotating cast of sympathetic friends, concerned business partners, and grim-faced law enforcement officers. Amelia and Ethan moved through the crowds, their faces etched with sorrow, accepting condolences, their shared secret a constant, burning presence between them. They were magnificent in their deception. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Prominent Businessman Lost in Tragic Boating Accident." The narrative they had so carefully constructed had been accepted without question. Frank Miller, a hard-drinking, reckless man who had finally pushed his luck too far. It was a tragedy, everyone agreed, but not a surprising one. After a week, the official search was called off. The Marsh, the authorities concluded, had claimed Frank Miller. His body would likely never be recovered, taken by the tides or the wildlife that thrived in the murky depths. A memorial service was planned. The final curtain had fallen. In the quiet moments, when they were finally alone, a new, intoxicating emotion began to surface between Amelia and Ethan. A sense of wild, triumphant freedom. They had done it. They had committed the perfect crime. The tyrant was dead, his reign of terror over. The world, it seemed, was finally theirs. As they stood on the veranda one evening, looking out at the same river that had been the scene of their crime, Amelia's hand found Ethan's. Her touch was no longer just passionate. It was victorious. They had written Frank's eulogy in the black, unforgiving water of the marsh, and they had gotten away with it. Or so they believed. In the months following Frank's memorial service, a new, deceptive kind of peace settled over Riverbend. The oppressive, silent tension that had been the hallmark of Frank's reign was gone, replaced by a quiet, somber atmosphere of mourning. For Clara, it was a period of profound, genuine grief. She mourned the father she had loved in spite of his flaws, her days marked by a listless sorrow. For Amelia and Ethan, however, the mourning was a performance, a necessary camouflage for the intoxicating reality of their new lives. The tyrant was gone. The cage was open. At first, their freedom was everything they had imagined. Ethan began playing his cello again, the music pouring out of him with a renewed, feverish passion. He filled the guest house with soaring, melancholic melodies, music that was both a celebration of his liberation and a lament for the innocence he had lost. Amelia, too, began to reclaim her old self. She unearthed the charcoal-stained easel from the closet and set it up in the sunroom. She began to sketch again, her hands at first hesitant, quickly regaining their old confidence. They were artists once more, their souls slowly, tentatively, coming back to life. Their affair continued, but now it was tinged with a new, dangerous sense of ownership. They were no longer just prisoners finding solace. They were co-conspirators, bound by a secret that was both a terrible burden and a thrilling, unbreakable bond. Their trysts were less frequent, conducted with an almost paranoid level of caution. The primary obstacle to their passion was now the ever-present, grieving Clara. Her sorrow was a constant reproach, a living monument to their betrayal. They couldn't be together, not truly, as long as she was there, a ghost at their secret feast. A new, unspoken problem had replaced the old one. But the perfect crime is a myth. It exists only in the minds of the criminals before the act. After, it begins to fray, to unravel thread by invisible thread. The first thread was pulled by a man named Deputy Mike Shaw. Shaw was a young, ambitious officer who had been one of the first to respond to Amelia's call on the night Frank disappeared. Unlike the older, more complacent sheriff, Shaw was bothered by the neatness of it all. He had found the scored fuel line during the initial inspection of the boat, but it had been dismissed by the Coast Guard investigator as a possible result of striking debris. To Shaw, it looked too clean, too deliberate. The case was closed, but it remained open in his mind, an itch he couldn't scratch. He began to quietly, unofficially dig. He started by looking at the Miller family finances, and what he found was a cascade of red flags. Frank's will left everything to Amelia, a vast fortune that she now controlled completely. Ethan, the struggling musician, had suddenly come into a significant amount of money, a gift from his grieving mother-in-law to help him and Clara get on their feet. The motive was as old as time, greed. The second thread was pulled by Ethan's own conscience. The guilt he had suppressed during the planning and execution of the murder began to return with a vengeance. Clara's grief was a constant, twisting knife in his gut. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in a cold sweat, the sound of her soft weeping from the next room a torment from which there was no escape. He started drinking heavily, trying to drown the ghosts that haunted him. He began to see Frank's cold, accusatory eyes in every shadow. The music he played became more discordant, more frantic, the sound of a man's soul tearing itself apart. Amelia, in contrast, remained a pillar of cold, unshakable resolve. She saw Ethan's unraveling not with sympathy, but with a growing sense of alarm. He was becoming a liability, his weakness a threat to the perfect world she had so carefully constructed. Her love for him had been forged in a crucible of shared victimhood. But now, with the victimizer gone, she began to see his sensitivity not as a virtue, but as a fatal flaw. The breaking point came on a stormy night, 6 months after Frank's death. Ethan, drunk and tormented by guilt, finally confessed. Not to the police but to Clara. In a torrent of slurred, sobbing words, he told her everything: the affair with her mother, the hatred for her father, the sabotage of the boat, the lies. He told her because he could no longer bear the weight of his secret, and because on some level he wanted to be punished, to be absolved. The effect on Clara was not the explosive rage or the hysterical grief he might have expected. A profound, terrifying stillness came over her. The sweet, gentle girl he had married vanished, and in her place was a woman made of ice and broken glass. Her love for him and her mother curdled into a hatred so pure, so absolute, it was breathtaking. Her entire world, every memory, every relationship, had been revealed as a monstrous lie. The next morning, she went to the sheriff's office and told Deputy Shaw the entire story. The arrests were made quietly, without drama. They found Ethan in the guest house, sitting in the dark, his cello in its case, a packed bag on the floor. He seemed to be waiting for them, his face a mask of weary resignation. They found Amelia in her sunroom, calmly sketching the Marsh, her face betraying no emotion at all, even as the handcuffs were snapped onto her wrists. The trial was a sensation, a lurid Gothic tale that scandalized the Lowcountry. The twisted passion of the mother-in-law and the son-in-law became the stuff of tabloid legend. In the end, their confessions, corroborated by Deputy Shaw's quiet investigation, were all the jury needed. They were both found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Clara left Riverbend, the house and its ghosts, forever. She moved across the country, changed her name, and tried to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. The Miller estate, once a symbol of power and wealth, became a notorious, decaying monument to a toxic legacy. Its gardens overgrown, its grand rooms silent and empty. In the end, the cage was not Frank. The cage was their own passion, their own hatred. In their desperate, bloody bid for freedom, Amelia and Ethan had only succeeded in building a new, more terrible prison, one of cold steel bars and the lifelong, haunting knowledge that they had destroyed the one person they both, in their own twisted ways, had claimed to love. The stillness of Riverbend had finally claimed them all.